Okay. On behalf of the Brookings Institution Board of Trustees, I welcome you to Brookings for the launch of a signature report from the Institute's Metropolitan Policy Program, Export Nation, How U.S. Metros Lead National Export Growth and Boost Competitiveness. This report continues the excellent work of the program in showing the central role that metropolitan areas play in reviving and sustaining America's economy. Shortly, Bruce Katz, who's the director of the program and a study co-author, will present the report, which provides a unique analysis of the export of goods and services from our metropolitan areas, ranks the 100 largest metros according to their level of export production and number of jobs created by exports, and identifies critical exporting firms. The report concludes with some specific policy recommendations for advancing the National Export Initiative. Panels later in the day will explore these topics from the perspective of policymakers, elected officials, and business people. I'm told the paper is already receiving significant attention from the administration, which I assume is a good thing. So congratulations to Amelia, Jonathan, Bruce, all the co-authors, and the Brookings team for advancing once again the discussion of what cities mean. The depth and impact of this report will not surprise observers of the Metropolitan Policy Program. When I got involved with the program nearly 3 years ago at Bruce's request, I assumed that you study cities primarily because they are the places where all of our thorniest social problems go to die and manifest themselves, the ones most traditionally continually considered urban: affordable housing, access to health care, public education, and so on. Bruce and his team have completely blown this conception wide open and now regularly present metropolitan areas as the last great hope for continued American economic predominance. Collecting immense amounts of raw data and working with the best public servants in the country to gather evidence of how the world actually works, Bruce and his team have developed a conception of cities that places them at the heart of every major policy innovation. He has advised cities here and around the world on sustainability, innovation clustering, economic development, and seemingly everything else. City leaders engage with the Metropolitan Policy Program because they understand that the world is changing dramatically, and they're looking for advice on how to adapt. Earlier this year, Brookings came out with the State of the Metropolitan America report, which anticipated the 2010 census findings and showed the incredible demographic upheaval our metropolitan areas have experienced, with endless social and policy implications to follow. Similarly, today's export report opens a new discussion, this one around the enormous and growing role cities play in global markets. My business, I'm a private equity professional, which is likely to get me drummed out of here as soon as I exit the stage, takes me around the world. My firm owns businesses based here and in Europe, doing billions of dollars in revenues every year, producing and selling to every country on earth. The findings in this report are absolutely consistent with what I see when I travel, and the recommendations, I believe, are absolutely necessary to restore growth and job creation in this country in the years to come. Before I turn it over to Bruce to present the report, just a few words of introduction. Bruce founded the Metropolitan Policy Program in 1996. The program defines the challenges facing cities and metropolitan areas by publishing cutting-edge research on major demographic, market development, and governance trends. Under Bruce's leadership, as I've said already, the program is articulating a vision for a new economy that is export-oriented, low-carbon, innovation-fueled, and opportunity-rich. This paper represents the first in a series of products that will showcase opportunities for our metropolitan areas. In addition to leading the Metropolitan Program at Brookings, Bruce is also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, which I actually did not know before I read that. Before coming to Brookings, Bruce served as Chief of Staff to Henry Cisneros, who was a former Secretary of HUD in the Clinton administration. Bruce, I turn it over to you.
How many people in the room are here to get out of the heat? Don't be shy. First of all, I want to thank Jamie for that introduction and for his leadership and his guidance and his friendship over the past number of years. Incredibly helpful to have business insight into what we're doing here. I also want to start by thanking Amelia Estrate and Jonathan Rothwell, who I hope are here, who are the co-authors of this report, and have spent an enormous amount of time exploring a critical but unexamined topic with rigor and persistence and good humor. So the report we feature today describes how America's metropolitan areas can lead the nation to a different kind of economy, an economy that creates quality jobs with good wages by exporting more goods and services abroad. In a global economy, exports begin at home, with private sector firms seizing market opportunities beyond our borders. Thus, it's best to begin with a story that takes us to Atlanta, Georgia, and a small company with large export ambitions. The company is Snchez. The products they make and sell are high-efficiency silicon solar cells and high-power solar modules. Between their founding in 2007 and the end of 2009, they racked up nearly $1 billion in orders from India and Europe. The company is the brainchild of Dr. Ajit Rougati, an Indian-born scientist educated in the United States. Like inventors before, Dr. Rougati was able to commercialize advanced research he conducted in the economy, in his case, the Georgia Institute of Technology. 90% of Snchez sales in 2009 were exports. 85% of the content of their products is U.S. made. The company is now working to build a second plant in Saginaw, Michigan, a symbol of economic renewal for that troubled industrial state. Snchez represents how the U.S., firm by firm, builds the next American economy, and in the process creates millions of private sector jobs. The Snchez economy is one that we at Brookings described, as Jamie said, export-oriented, low-carbon, innovation-fueled, and opportunity-rich. In other words, an economy where we export more, we waste less, we innovate in what matters, we produce and deploy more of what we invent, and we make economic growth work for the many rather than the few. The report we released today focuses on exports and makes three critical points. First, the U.S. must and can become an export nation. This is a recipe for a job-filled rather than a jobless recovery, and a vehicle for raising our standards of living, tapping new sources of global demand, and bringing balance back to our economy. Second, U.S. metros will be the vanguard of national export growth. These places here and abroad are the hubs of trade, commerce, and migration, and the centers for talent, capital, and innovation. They are the path to an export nation. Finally, we must connect the macro export vision to the metropolitan export reality, the macro to the metro. For too long, export policy has been narrowly confined to macro levers, like currency exchange and trade agreements. It is time to boost exports through broader federal, state, and metropolitan interventions on innovation and infrastructure, education and immigration, trade promotion, and cluster expansion. This is a competitiveness agenda designed to improve the quality of the goods and services we produce in the United States and better connect firms and the goods and services they produce to global markets. Now, I've already used the word export 14 times in the last 2 minutes, which leads to an initial question, what's an export? Now, people typically think of exports as goods that are manufactured here, put in a box, and placed on a ship that takes them to foreign markets. Now, that's only part of the story and overlooks the growing importance of service exports. When a U.S. firm designs a building in Shanghai, that's a service export. When a foreign student pays tuition at an American university, that's a service export. A service export can include a tourist from abroad paying to see the sights in New York. And it includes royalties for American movies and music that are consumed abroad. Now, given that broad definition, let me begin by offering a vision for an export nation. This is a vision where more firms in more sectors trade more goods and services seamlessly with the world, particularly with the rising nations that are rapidly urbanizing and industrializing. President Obama embraced this vision in his State of the Union when he called for a doubling of exports in 5 years. The departure from the current order of business could not be starker. The American economy has become dominated by imports rather than driven by exports. In 2008, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, total exports made up only 13% of the GDP of the U.S., compared to 36% in China, 35% in Canada, 24% in India, and higher levels in Japan and Europe. Exporting has become almost an unnatural act in the United States. Incredibly, according to the Department of Commerce, less than 1% of American companies export. And of those that do, less than half exported to more than one country. The movement of freight in the United States is compromised, undermined by an infrastructure that is third class and transport networks that are clogged and congested. Now, all of this is true and sobering, but there's a cultural dimension to exports which often gets overlooked. Americans don't get out much. We are remarkably insular, despite being a demographically blessed nation with a growing and diversifying population. Half the population thinks the U.S. should mind its own business. Remarkably, 72% of U.S. citizens don't even have a passport. So can we get back into the export game? We think the answer is decidedly yes. The U.S. still manufactures a range of advanced goods that the rest of the world wants: aircraft, spacecraft, electrical machinery, precision surgical instruments, high-quality pharmaceutical products. The U.S. is also the world's largest exporter of services. We already have a trade surplus in commercial services, $152 billion in 2008, and are poised for a quantum leap in exports in sectors such as education, healthcare, business and management consulting, and architecture and engineering. The consequences of shifting to an export-oriented economy are profound. In a jobless recovery, growing exports means more jobs. The administration has estimated that doubling exports will generate 2 million new jobs. We think that estimate is exceedingly conservative, and that the real impact could be much higher, 3, 4, even 5 million new jobs. In an economy polarized by income, growing exports means higher wages for more workers. Research shows that exporting firms pay workers more, and export-intense industries are more likely to provide health and retirement benefits. In 2008, for example, the top 5 exporting industries, advanced machinery, business services, transportation, chemicals, computer and electronic products, delivered almost half the value of total exports. Each of these industries pay workers with wages that are higher than the national average wage. Computer and electronics paid the most among the top U.S. exporting industries, 85% more than the national average wage. In an economy crippled by ruined credit, growing exports means taking full advantage of the growth in Brazil, India, China, and other rising nations. We are about to cross an economic Rubicon. Brazil, India, and China, the BRICS, are expected to account for about a fifth of the global GDP in 2010, surpassing the United States for the first time. This will grow to more than 25% by 2015. The rise of the BRICS reflects the rise of metros. For the first time in recorded history, more than half of the world's population lives in urban and metropolitan areas. By 2030, the metro share will surpass 60%. Across the globe, metro economies are driving demand for increased trade and commerce, only temporarily abated by this downturn. The rise of the BRICS also reflects the emergence of a global middle class. According to a recent Brookings study, the middle class spending of the Asia-Pacific region alone will increase from 28% of the world total in 2009 to 54% in 2020. Consumers in rising nations will have the power to purchase the products and services we export in an unprecedented way. Final point. In a nation saddled with debt and deficit, growing exports means a return to economic sanity and economic balance. Americans have been consuming too much, and we've been exporting too little. Over the last 30 years, the U.S. share of domestic GDP attributable to consumption has risen by 7 percentage points. In other G7 countries, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, private consumption has stayed at a constant share of GDP. Exports pose a very different, disturbing picture. Exports as a share of GDP rose by almost 7 percentage points in other G7 nations, while barely budging in the U.S. This pattern of failing to exploit market opportunities abroad while living beyond our means at home is simply unsustainable. It contributed in no small measure to the bubble-bursting economy of the past decade, as foreign resources helped overstimulate the U.S. housing market. It is time to change, and it is time to make exporting a central narrative of America's economic renewal. So here's our second proposition. Metros will be the vanguard of national export growth. Any growth in exports, doubling or not, will begin with our major metropolitan areas. Here's the real heart of the American economy. 100 metropolitan areas that, after decades of growth, take up only 12% of our land mass, but house 2/3 of our population and generate 75% of our GDP. These communities form a new economic geography, enveloping cities and suburbs, exurbs, and rural towns. Our report shows the extent to which these top 100 metros in the aggregate drive U.S. exports. In 2008, they produce an estimated 64% of U.S. exports, including 75% of service exports and 62% of manufactured goods that are sold abroad. Incredibly, the top 100 metros even produce 25% of America's agricultural exports and almost a third of oil, gas, and mining exports. The top 100 metros dominate 7 of the 10 largest U.S. export sectors. This includes 68% of chemical exports, the top U.S. export to Brazil and India, 76% of computer and electronic goods exports, the top U.S. export to China, and 80% of business and professional service exports, the number 1 U.S. service export to China. Now, here we're talking about goods and services produced within the top 100 metros, but these places also play another critical role in trade. They are the nation's logistical hubs, concentrating the movement of people and goods by air, rail, and sea. The metro economies, of course, do not exist in the aggregate. They have distinctive starting points, and they vary considerably in the export prowess and intensity. Our research digs deep to profile the export potential of each of the top 100 metros. Here's what we find. The nation's 4 largest exporting metros, New York, Chicago, LA, and Houston, are supersized performers, exporting more than $50 billion apiece in 2008. Other major metros, Dallas, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Seattle, are also global players, exporting more than $24 billion apiece that year. These 10 large metros generated 43% of the exports of the top 100 metros and 28% of all national exports in 2008. This is not just about the large metros. As we see here, a different group of smaller and medium-sized metros are dependent on exports in ways that larger metros are not. Exports contributed more than 15% of gross metropolitan product in these 10 U.S. metros. Now, the power of these places is the power of agglomeration and the power of networks. Let's take Wichita, for example. Wichita is the nation's most export-intense metropolis, with 28% of its metropolitan output coming from exports. Transportation equipment drives the lion's share of Wichita's exports, with more than 65% of that metro's exports coming from the sales of aircraft and aircraft parts. Jobs in the transportation sector pay well, more than $61,500 on average, significantly higher than the average national wage of $45,500 and change. In total, exports are responsible for 22% of total employment in that area and 71,000 jobs. The Wichita sector represents a well-tuned network of public, private, and nonprofit firms and institutions. Firms like Cessna and Hawker Beechcraft are global players in aviation, servicing demands in countries ranging from Germany, Japan, to the UK. These firms compete, but they also collaborate. They share a thick labor market of skilled workers and benefit from a wide range of supporting firms and institutions like parts suppliers, Cox Machine and Perfecta, the National Institute for Aviation Research, the Wichita Technology Corporation, and Wichita State University. The Wichita story is repeated over and over in the top 100 metros. Now, we've prepared export profiles for each of these places, which are available on our website. And these specific profiles illustrate the general proposition that metros are the vanguard of national growth. So that leads to the final proposition. The U.S. must connect its metro export or macro export vision to metro economic reality, the macro to the metro. Now, for decades, trade and export policy has only been about getting the big stuff right, working to compel a reevaluation of foreign currencies so that U.S. goods are accurately priced, working to open foreign markets so U.S. firms can compete fairly with foreign competitors, working aggressively on the next generation of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Now, all of that is fundamental, and it must continue. But we compete in a fiercely competitive world where established nations like Germany and rising nations like China, India, and Brazil are growing exports purposefully through other channels, transformative investments in innovation institutes, modern ports, freight rail, export promotion, even facility construction. To compete with these global powerhouses, the U.S. needs a competitiveness agenda that is uniquely aligned with our entrepreneurial nation, where quality growth and jobs emerge from the DNA of metropolitan America. Private firms, large and small, research institutions, investors, governments, trade associations, philanthropy, and labor. Now, this is a playbook where the federal and state governments should lead where they must, given the need to level the global playing field and buttress a large national market. At the same time, networks of metropolitan leaders and firms must innovate where they should, given their distinct export clusters and special responsibilities for educating and training the workforce that serve those clusters. For our federal and state leaders, it's time to invest and reform. We know that innovation is the historic catalyst and fuel for economic growth. To compete abroad, we must boost innovation at home so that our goods and services are of the highest quality. Yet federal and state innovation efforts are still scattered, fundamentally divorced from manufacturing, and ill-resourced by a tax code that is still heavily tilted towards real estate and consumption. We call for a national innovation foundation, modeled on efforts in Korea and Finland, to bring under one roof and ramp up the government's fragmented efforts to boost commercial innovations in fields such as precision manufacturing, IT, and clean energy. Now, beyond innovation, we must focus on connectivity, linking firms and metros to markets around the world. The global connectivity requires a national freight strategy. Yet in the face of rising imports and exports, the feds and the states, this is a historic matter, often disperse scarce infrastructure dollars based on political reward, earmarks, rather than market returns. We call for a new national infrastructure bank to invest with evidence and purpose through public-private partnerships for the future. Intermodal facilities at our congested ports, high-speed passenger and freight rail, as in many of our competitor nations, modern transmission lines to carry renewable energy seamlessly across state lines. Connectivity also requires smart and strategic export promotion. Yet while our foreign competitors promote exports in deliberate ways through sophisticated networks of outreach, facilitation, and support, our federal and state efforts tend to be timid and fragmented. We fundamentally applaud the President's National Export Initiative and all the work going on at ITA and Exim Bank and many of the other agencies. But there is much work to do in coordinating export promotion and assistance across all levels of government. The work of coordination can start with expanding the President's Export Advisory Council to include state and local leaders, such as governors, mayors, county executives, and heads of metro business chambers, universities, and economic development corporations. We need a fundamental overhaul of our federalist approach to export promotion, requiring state and local players to be at the federal table. Now, a national competitiveness strategy requires metros to innovate. There is a lot of work to do, frankly, probably more work to do at that level than at the federal and state level. For most cities and metros today, economic development focuses either on Starbucks and stadia, real estate plays, or on old-style tax abatements to lure firms to steal firms, generally from one municipality to another. This kind of economic development strategy resembles the prior economy, overly consumption-oriented, excessively wasteful. Ideally, every single metro in the U.S. should have a metropolitan export initiative that is evidence-driven, cluster-led, goals-oriented, and metropolitan in scope. And ideally, these initiatives should be organized and even implemented by business, with support from other sectors, civic, government, labor, and university, that are critical to success. Export initiatives must be evidence-driven because export growth must start with metros understanding who they are in the global marketplace. This requires moving beyond outdated regional notions of economic composition. In the South, for instance, Charlotte has a different export profile than nearby Greensboro. Austin is distinct from San Antonio. Likewise, the notion of a unified Rust Belt stretching across large portions of the Northeast and Midwest overlooks the factors that distinguish export economies in Rochester, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and Chicago from one another. Export initiatives must be cluster-led to reflect the way metro economies actually function. This is the Bay Area. By clustering in close proximity networks of for-profit firms and the institutions, companies, and associations that support them. Cluster-led strategies include tailored interventions on land, labor, and capital, as well as marketing and promotion. Export initiatives must be goals-oriented so that aspirations can be set and progress can be measured. Just as the President has set an export goal for the nation, metros should set export goals for themselves on export job growth or scale of exports or number of exporting firms. Nothing focuses the metro mind like a unified goal. And finally, metropolitan export initiatives must be metropolitan in scope. It sounds fairly obvious, but currently there's a mismatch between the fragmented geography of government on one hand and the integrated geography of the economy on the other. Stuttgart, Germany, an export powerhouse, has one economic development entity, one, despite having 169 separate municipalities. American metros must do the same. Rather than compete against each other with scarce resources, U.S. metros must collaborate to compete. So let me end where I began. The Great Recession forces us to think differently about the shape of the economy and to purposefully lay the foundation for a radically different kind of growth. We need to get about the business of restructuring our economy towards exports and low carbon in favor of innovation, fueled by education and skills, so that we can compete globally and put the United States back on the path to prosperity. This path runs directly through our metropolitan areas. If the U.S. is to become an export nation, major metros will be the vanguard of national export growth. They are the places that concentrate the firms, the entrepreneurs, and the workers at the cutting edge of innovation. They are the places that have the infrastructure to connect to growing markets abroad. They are the places that have the talent and the energy to push our economy forward to a prosperity that is real and sustainable. In a global economy, exports begin at home, the major metros that are on the front lines of global exchange. We are a metro nation, and if we finally start to act like one, we can become a powerful export nation. Thank you very much. So that is the sound and light show for the morning. At some point, we were actually thinking of doing the Rambo video, but Warner Brothers won't let us. So let me open up for questions. We have a few minutes and before I introduce Chrystia. Thoughts, comments, criticisms, including from my own staff. Trust me, they're not shy. Any thoughts? If not, there's one over here.
Hi, Eric Miller. I represent Canada's Department of Industry in Washington. One of the things you see with Canada-U.S. trade is that a third of bilateral trade is intra-firm and a third is within established supply chains. Obviously, it's easier to conceptualize a world in which you're dealing with finished goods and services. Yeah. How does the dynamics of complex global supply chains impact your vision?
Yeah. You should have been as part of some of our conversations internally here, because obviously we live in that world. And part of the statistical challenge, frankly, is to try to sort of take out these kind of sophisticated exchanges. What gets made abroad, what gets packaged here, or vice versa. I think as we go forward, and this is partly in work with some partners in the administration, the first thing we have to do is make sure that the statistical base, the data infrastructure for exports coming out of the U.S., particularly with powerful trading partners like Canada, is as sophisticated and granular and precise as it can be. because we're dealing in a world now also where it's not just goods, it's services, and our data infrastructure is decades out of whack. Secondly, I think what your question requires us to understand is the power of clusters and the power of networks of firms, large or small, their supporting infrastructure of NGOs, other private sector firms, and the way in which these clusters operate at the global scale. I think for a long time, what we've tended to do is to separate out the sort of macro vision of the economy, which doesn't tend to have sort of a spatial sense, and the local vision of the economy, which I've said before, has tended recently to be more real estate oriented than tradable sector oriented. The way to match up the macro to metro is through clusters, is to really accept that that is the way, particularly the wealth generating sectors of our economy, are organized. And then to try to map them, I mean, obviously Michael Porter has done much of this work, not just here, but in Europe and elsewhere, so that we can understand these sophisticated interactions, and we can understand the way in which we partner as well as compete with others abroad. So Canada, in many respects, should be a close partner with the U.S., both on research to unveil how interconnected our economies are, but then also on policy and other interventions. Great question, and I think it gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. Other thoughts, comments, criticisms? Yep, back over here. Yep. I think that's a great question, and I think, one of the great things about the United States is we invent a lot of things which then get produced and deployed abroad. I include cluster strategy in that. I think if Michael Porter was here today, he would probably talk about, they love me in Europe, but at home, I don't get as much respect. Hopefully that's changing, under this administration and other state governments. In some ways, I have the same response to your question as to the prior question. I think the U.S. economy, in many respects, is a much more interconnected, interlinked network between large metros, small and medium-sized metros, and many of the non-metropolitan areas. We tend to think about these things in very compartmentalized ways, without understanding, the sort of fruitful synergy that occurs in various clusters of the economy. A couple months ago, we had a forum here on the National Infrastructure Bank. And, in our view, not surprising, the United States needs to make some targeted, sustained interventions in our major air, rail, and sea hubs. L.A. Long Beach, to start with just one. We had the head of the Kansas Department of Transportation come here, who basically said, I understand where the agricultural products that we produce in Kansas are shipped abroad, and I understand where the imports we bring in for Kansas consumers or for Kansas industries are shipped from. So we have an interest in the heartland, though, frankly, Kansas, the majority of Kansas's GDP is metropolitan-led. But in talking about the non-metropolitan aspects of that economy, we understand from a logistics perspective the interconnection between metro and non-metro, between major ports and economic prosperity. I think we have to take that same notion of connectivity and apply it to clusters that obviously move across borders in seamless and integrated ways. Maybe one more question, and then we can go. Yep.
Thank you. Andy Caloris with Dow Corning.
An American question.
American question. There you go. The striking statistic of only 1% of American companies exporting, that stood out to me. And I know that there's discussion about whether we should be focusing on boosting the exports of the 1% that already export, or should we be focusing on the 99% that don't, given that we have scarce resources, not only from a from dollars and cents perspective, but sort of from a policy energy perspective.
Right.
Which one should we be focusing on, the 99% or the 1%?
Yeah, I think this is a really central question for decision makers, some of whom are here today. Frankly, we come away from this work feeling like we do need to. This is a classic Brookings response. The researchers say we need more research, but this is why it's like a full-time employment in these operations. But I do think that what this work leads you to think about is the structure of different sectors of the economy. So in the goods production sector, obviously the presence of multinationals, the presence of supply chains are quite pronounced, and they're quite different, really, from different parts of manufacturing. Service exports, I think, a different structure, right? So it partly sort of depends on where you think growth might be in different segments of the economy. I don't think you can ignore, particularly in the service sector, the potential for SMEs to trade abroad. And what that requires is a level of facilitative assistance that we probably have never experienced in the United States before. I know, Fred and Frank inherit this sort of network of export assistance centers. It's not entirely clear to us that network is a 21st century network that is fully taking advantage of the web and the internet, to supply, particularly with peer-to-peer, matched with peer-to-peer counseling, the kind of advice and guidance you need to crack into particular markets and then to move on to other markets. All that said, I do think that there is enormous growth that we could achieve by understanding better what this 1% does. And again, of that 1%, less than half actually export to more than one country. So getting that 1% to move to another country might be, if you're really trying to prioritize, the most, immediate kind of payback. But I do think that, we'd like to see a broad-based export initiative that takes, full account of the talent and energy and dynamism of this economy and the changing nature of global demand. And so we might, in the near term, because of the recession and because of the jobless recovery, want to prioritize in ways that you described, if we can find some of this more granular information. But I think going forward, we really need a broad-based approach. One thing about the 1% number is that it does underestimate the supply chains and how many firms in this country ultimately interact with multinational corporations in their exporting abroad. And unveiling that and understanding how fundamental exports are to American job growth, standards of living, and just economic sanity, is I think part of the road back as well. I think one more question and then someone's going to kick me off. Or maybe I'll kick myself off and that'll get us going. Okay, I'm going to shut up. So let me do this. Let me transition to the panels because I think that's really the most important thing is to hear from senior people in the administration and to hear from elected officials, business, and other leaders who can sort of react and respond but also take this forward. We are privileged to have here Chrystia Freeland to moderate both panels. This is a sign of true masochism. But, since she offered, we said, okay. I think many folks in this audience obviously watch Chrystia on the Sunday talk shows and other talk shows. She is a senior leader at Reuters. Before then, she held senior positions at the Financial Times. She is the right person to moderate these panels. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have an action-packed morning. We're going to run until 12. And my first job is to warn everybody that this is all an on-the-record session. I know that all of us journalists here hope you will all be very controversial and say indiscreet things, but if you do, you have been warned. And then my other job is going to be a good timekeeper, so we will try. I promise you that we'll be done at noon. That's going to be a lot of action packed in. Our first panel I was very excited about. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, ask them to come on, and while I'm briefly talking about them, they will be mic'd up. We didn't have enough mics to go around beforehand, so that's why we're doing it that way. So the first panel, the two panelists will be Fred Hochberg of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Come on up. Fred has long experience in business and in government. I emphasize the business part. He was the president and COO of the Lillian Vernon Corporation. I thought that was a particularly important thing to bring up because I work in New York and I hear a lot of complaints about how Washington doesn't understand how business actually works. So I think it's particularly good to have someone that we're talking to who not only is in government but can speak to the actual work of running a company. And then our second panelist is Francisco Snchez, the Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Sure. He, too, has experience of business. He was the Hispanic Businessman of the Year for Tampa and has experience working in Colombia and Ecuador, as well as really extensive experience in government. And with that, I'm going to sit down and start asking them questions. The way we'll run this panel is I'll ask them questions for about 25 minutes. Then it will be your turn. At 11 o'clock, we'll move to our next panel. So do start getting your questions ready. And I think probably we might bring Bruce into the conversation from time to time, since that was a really excellent and multimedia presentation, if I can compliment you on that, too. Guys, you have your mics? You're good? Okay.
Live. You're the only one that's on.
Yeah. So the first thing, I thought a good point to start with was, in a way, the elephant in the room of Bruce's presentation, which is this macro to metro point. I think it sounds great that America should export more, and certainly from the U.S. perspective, that seems essential. But that requires that other people consume more. Is that going to happen? And to what extent is getting that global framework, those global financial and trade imbalances shifted, essential before any of this great work that Bruce is talking about can even start to happen?
One, I want to thank Bruce for this presentation. Bruce and I met a couple of years ago. I was at the university, and we've reconnected in the administration. And a lot of the work that's being done here very much is helpful to us, very much mirrors what we're trying to do at the Ex-Im Bank. So I want to thank Bruce for this, and it's a great sort of blueprint for us to work forward on. I just got back from Turkey on Sunday. To give you just two illustrations, I met with the Minister of Deputy Minister for Economics. They have $350 billion worth of infrastructure projects in the next 10 years. And in the power sector, it's $150 billion by 2023, which is the 100th anniversary of Turkey as a government. So that's $500 billion. That's $500 billion. We don't need that big a percentage of that. We only need our little fair share, and we're going to do. And right now we export less than $5 billion to Turkey, just to give you an illustration. And I see that, in Mexico, right south of the border, they've got $100 billion worth of infrastructure projects planned in the next 5 to 8 years. In Colombia, it's about $50 billion in the mining and extracting world alone. So the amount of money that's going to be spent at the government level, the public-private partnership level, in country after country is enormous. So
on infrastructure.
On infrastructure. And
if I could ask, being a Canadian, I'll ask a rude foreigner's question, which is, you guys don't seem that good at your own infrastructure. Why should, the Turks and the Colombians be relying on you to build it for them?
Okay, but I'll answer that. One, we actually do make some of the best aircraft in the world. That's infrastructure. We make some of the best renewable energy like Snchez. We actually are the leaders in freight locomotives worldwide. Between GE and EMD, which is now part of Caterpillar, we are the world leader in locomotives. So that's a good question. And in medical technology, we may have a very high-cost healthcare system, but we are also the gold standard, if you can still use that word, for medical technology. So the kind of products we excel at, we're the largest manufacturing country in the world still, and particularly when you add in services, we actually do sell the exact kind of products that is going to fuel the global economics for the next decade.
Francisco, do you want to jump in?
Well, let me answer the second question first. I think we're actually very good at infrastructure. We just may not be investing as much as we should, but in the making of it, we're actually quite good. Let me first say congratulations to Bruce, to Amelia, and to Jonathan for putting a spotlight on exports because it's absolutely crucial to a vibrant U.S. economy. And to your first question, the answer is resoundingly yes. 95% of the world's consumers live outside our borders. As Bruce pointed out in his presentation, countries like China, Brazil, India have economies that were a fraction of what they were just 10 years ago. Like Fred, I travel a lot, lead trade missions. I was in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And to add to Fred's list, those two countries, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, over the next 10 years will spend $750 billion in a whole array of infrastructure projects, everything from healthcare to education to improving their petrochemical business to water management services, a whole host of environmental services. So the demand is clearly there. We have the capability, and we have to have a concerted, integrated export strategy.
You've mentioned China. To what extent is that a possible big consumer of U.S. exports? You mentioned GE as well, and Jeff Immelt has sort of famously recently been skeptical about his ability to actually make money exporting into China. Is that going to happen, and is that sort of a bilateral relationship issue?
Well, we're already exporting a lot to China, and I think that market's going to continue to grow, and yes, it will be an important market for us. That isn't to say that we don't have challenges. China still presents a number of trade barriers that we have to deal with and contend with. USTR and Commerce and others work on it every day. But it will be an important market for us, and it won't be the only market. I mean, we have to look at the other big countries, but beyond that, there are a number of other emerging markets. Turkey, where Fred was, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Indonesia, Vietnam. All of these present great opportunities. So yes to China, and we need to have a more diversified strategy.
And on China, you haven't mentioned the currency. How important is that?
Well, since you mentioned this was on the record.
You're allowed to forget that.
I think Fred will agree that we defer to Secretary Geithner on currency policy matters, so I'm going to defer to the Secretary on that one.
Are you going to defer to Fred, or do you have strong China
I'm not
currency
an idiot.
views?
Let me say one thing. We've identified at Ex-Im Bank 9 countries that are focused for where we see particularly export growth. And we chose them because they have high GDP growth, a huge appetite for infrastructure, as Francisco mentioned with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and where our financing can make a difference. Briefly, those 9 countries in our hemisphere, it's Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. It's Turkey, Nigeria, and South Africa, just going across the globe, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia, a number that Francisco mentioned. In our case, China's not on my list.
How did you pick that list?
By strong GDP growth, an appetite for infrastructure, and a real commitment to investing in infrastructure, and where our financial leverage, the Ex-Im Bank financing, can actually make a difference to move those projects forward more quickly. China doesn't need our money. big surprise. So that's not part of so my point is we've had an opportunity to sort of narrow our focus and say we're going to focus on these, particularly these 9 markets. And that was last year we did business in 80 markets. We do business in total in 150, but to focus our resources, Bruce and I use the same sort of construct of more companies to more countries to more customers. We realize we've got to focus that in a couple of industries and a number of countries to really have an impact, to move President Obama's National Export Initiative and make this more and more a possibility and more of a reality.
Okay, so speaking of focus, to what extent do you buy Bruce's Metro point? Is the way to achieve these goals working through cities?
Totally. I have a trip to Wichita in about 10 days. Wichita has been a very important hub for Ex-Im Bank. No surprise, Seattle, Washington with Boeing is a very large concentration. When I spoke here about a month ago, mentioned Geneva. That is a key metro area in the sort of Atlanta area. Miami, which is on the list, we have a company, a small business that does. Francisco and I both know this company. In fact, Francisco took this company to Saudi Arabia, Dept. Yep. Small company, just give you an idea, located in Miami, makes surgical sutras, sort of actually not that high tech, but highly precision medical technology. Last year they did $4 million. This year, for the first time, he had his first $1 million month. And Francisco took him to Saudi Arabia, and he got his first $500,000 order in Saudi Arabia. So that was connecting a metro area right to Saudi Arabia and building that bridge.
The answer is absolutely yes.
I'm also his press agent.
Yeah. I can see that.
Keep it up. We have a network of trade specialists throughout the country, and wherever possible, we try to co-locate with state and local economic development authorities. The fact is that, and I think Bruce alluded to this in his presentation, we have to work a lot smarter, and that includes better partnerships, and clearly better partnerships with state and local government, and better use of technology. And we're getting there. So in terms of partnerships, we're trying to increase the number of co-locations with state and local government. We're creating a much closer nexus to a thing called district export councils, which are voluntary organizations of businesses, mostly SMEs, some academics as well, that help companies that want to export. So we're doing much better on partnering. Our next goal is to improve the use of technology so that a lot of the things that have been handed down from person to person can be accessible through technology. So yes, it's critical that we work closely. We're doing it. We're going to do more of it in the future.
That sounds great and very motherhood and apple pie, and no one's going to object to going on a trip with you to Saudi Arabia or sharing your great technology. But as I read Bruce's presentation, there was a harder edge there too. And one of his points was there has to be more of a cluster strategy. U.S. metro areas have to more aggressively choose what their area of specialization is and not fight with each other. Is the U.S. government prepared to be the referee or the judge in that kind of a national industrial strategy?
Well, I won't speak for Fred. I don't know that it's our role to be a referee. I think it is our role to be a facilitator and to encourage smart thinking in these areas.
Is Bruce right to have identified a problem? I mean, is it an issue that metros aren't focusing on what should be their core strength and are competing?
I think some metropolitan areas are doing it better than others. As illustrated in Bruce's presentation, there are some metropolitan sectors who have formed clusters around a particular industry or industries, and they're thriving. And I think it does make sense. I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, is it the role of the federal government to impose that strategy? I don't think so. But I do think there are ways to encourage smart thinking in this area, and that is a role that the federal government should play.
We at Ex-Im Bank, we have 53 what we call city-state partners, where it's either a local chamber or a trade export association in each of those different municipalities and counties. When I got to the job a little over a year ago, one of the things I wanted to do was invite in the economic development officers of all 50 governors as a start. Frankly, I had a harder time getting that off the ground. I actually think, starting with President Obama talking about the National Export Initiative at the State of the Union, followed up by this kind of work, when I want to do that this fall, it'll be a lot easier to get pick up on that than I think it even was a year ago. So, this is the first time, I suspect, for anybody in this audience that a president of the United States has actually named exports as a national priority. It was sort of, well, if it happens, it happens. These companies will figure it out on their own. No place else in the world, not one other country in the world says, oh, well, we'll let industry figure it out on their own. And if they make it, stand on your own 2 feet. It's an American thing. You don't need any government help.
But you guys are supposed to be laissez-faire capitalists. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe having this sort of dirigiste government approach doesn't work. There's tons of economic literature about how governments are bad at picking winners.
Well, I'm not talking about picking winners. Francisco made it very clear. It's about creating an environment and setting up a facilitation. We need companies like his example of taking this small company to Saudi Arabia. They would not have found their way to Saudi Arabia all on their own. They would not have gotten into the meetings to meet with the kind of healthcare distributors in those countries without little government assistance.
Look, I think that it's not all or nothing. I don't think that you have to have an industrial policy that dictates every aspect. I think there are plenty of examples around the world where that has failed miserably. But we do have a role to play. In our area, like Fred, we're trying to be much more focused. So we're focusing on emerging markets, emerging technology, and capacity building. That's 3 of our core areas. Emerging markets, you've heard us talk about some of them. Emerging technology.
Do you endorse Fred's 9, or do you have a different
Fred has a much narrower focus. Fred's job is to help facilitate export financing. We have a little broader focus, so we have a broader number of countries in our emerging market bucket. But virtually every one that he listed is in ours, and then we have some additional ones. But in emerging technologies, we still invest more than any other country in the world in research and development. That gives us a competitive advantage, so we need to focus on the alternative energy opportunities that both of these 2 gentlemen, their companies represent. Healthcare technology, we need to focus on that because we have competitive advantages. Smart grid technology. And then another area that is not necessarily innovative, but I think provides tremendous opportunity, and Fred mentioned it, is infrastructure projects. Governments are spending just enormous amounts of money in infrastructure, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Libya, Algeria, Turkey, everywhere. There's vast amounts. So we're focusing on that as well. And then the third area is capacity building. And capacity building at home means focusing on SMEs. And if I could take a second to respond to the question that you posed, the gentleman from Dow Corning, should we focus on those companies that are already exporting, or should we try to get the companies that aren't? I would argue that we have to do both. And we have to do both in a smart way, and I believe the federal government is trying to do it in a smart way. And what do I mean by that? The International Trade Administration, which has a relatively small network, is focusing on that 58% that Bruce mentioned, that 58%, by the way, of the 1% of American companies that export, that only go to one country. We're focusing on those companies because they're export ready. So we can help them because they're ready to hit the ground running. But that isn't to say that there aren't companies that aren't exporting that need to focus on that. So we're working very closely with the SBA, which has 1,400 business counselors all over the United States. And we're going to have them prepare those companies rather than have our limited resources focus on it. So I think we can do both, but clearly we have to do it in a much smarter strategy than we have in the past.
One point that Bruce made in his presentation was about the parochialism of Americans and American business. Is he right? And do you want to do something about it if he is?
The difficulty, I think, we have here on exporting, and it's interesting, I found it paralleled when I was in Brazil. When I was in Brazil, for example, it's a country with 200 million people, growing very quickly. A lot of companies there say, why should I bother exporting? I speak Portuguese, I have to learn another language, I got to deal with tariffs, I got to deal with shipping.
And maybe they're right. Maybe it makes sense.
And American, particularly SMEs in this country, this market was so big and so broad and so rich.
Not Finland.
You didn't need to do so. Germany didn't have that luxury. Finland didn't have that luxury. The fact is, we don't have that luxury anymore. We're going to be a 3% growth. We're not going to be at
Going to be 3% growth?
U.S. economy. But we're not going to be at the 7, 8, 9% like Turkey, like Brazil, like India, like China. And if you're a businessman, you've got to say, well, if that's where the growth is, I'm going to invest in those areas. I'm going to put my resources in those areas. We're finding, and it's one of the things Jamie mentioned, being private equity. Private equity firms, frankly, can do well by exporting. And a number of them, Snchez and others we deal with, are focused a lot of their efforts on outside the United States market because they see that as actually, as opposed to in the past where you saturate the U.S. market and then when that was saturated, go abroad. We're seeing companies that actually start with going abroad and then are backing into looking at our market.
I can give you a number of stories of companies who 10 years ago, 12 years ago, exported nothing. And today, anywhere from 20 to 50, in some cases 80% of their revenue comes from abroad. I think those kinds of stories are going to be more the norm than the exception. And it's precisely what Fred says. The world has changed. I don't know if it's because we were parochial, but the fact is we had a very strong market. And so if you can sell a lot of your goods and services here, why go abroad? But the fact is that the world is changing, and we need to change with it. So I think that to the extent that we've been parochial, I believe that will somewhat change naturally, and with a little help from Brookings to highlight this challenge and others, I think we'll move in the direction of being much more global in our thinking.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I hope everyone else will help me out. And please, you've had some warm-up time, so ask some hard questions. These are your government officials on the line. I think, it's now become a truism in business circles that, globalization is a reality. Businesses have to think global. One way businesses think global is actually by setting up operations outside the U.S., by operating directly in those 8 or 9% growth economies where, by the way, you can find a very educated workforce as well. What is to stop that from being the dominant phenomenon? Why do you guys think that the U.S. can have export-led growth out of Wichita rather than people setting up in Brazil, in Turkey, etc.?
It's going to be a mix, but I'll give you an illustration. Yesterday at our board meeting at the Ex-Im Bank, we approved a transaction where Siemens, manufacturing in Charlotte, one of our cities that Bruce identified, is exporting power turbines to Korea. So here's a foreign company, German company, locating here, and many companies that located here initially were about selling to this market are now exporting from this market.
Did Charlotte have to pay them a lot of money to set up
That's
there?
before my time. I have no idea I don't know what Charlotte did to get them there.
Do they get lots of tax breaks to stay?
That's out of my portfolio. My portfolio is about getting them to create jobs in America and selling goods abroad. That's what I care about. I stay in my own lane.
That's a good dodge.
No, that was a direct answer. Why do you ask me about something that happened 20 years ago? I wasn't there 20 years ago when they moved. But I think that, there is great expertise. I mean, we're helping Bombardier, which makes Learjets, is going to be keeping its manufacturing in Wichita. They're actually importing some of the supplies from overseas, but bringing them to Wichita to assemble and make the new Learjet 85. So a lot of the manufacturing is still here. It's the expertise is here. GE locomotives, when they do have a demand, and sometimes there's a demand that they're going to sell locomotives to India, that some of the assembly is done there. And the term I've learned, they actually send them, quote-unquote, kits, which essentially is a partially completed piece of equipment, and then it gets completed there. Snchez does a number of times they sell their solar panels, and they get installed, the cells get installed into a panel in country. We're going to have to get used to the fact that it's not going to be all or nothing. We're not going to keep 100% of it and just send over there, and there's going to be some sharing back and forth. Just the way, think about it, foreign auto manufacturers opened up here in America. We're going to have some of it here and some of it there, but if we keep our eye on the macro issue and the global issue, we will do a lot better.
Well, and to add to that, when you have foreign direct investment overseas, in almost every case, those companies buy goods and services to support their operations. So in many ways, they help increase exports. I want to go back to a point that was made in the presentation earlier, that exports are the definition of exports. And probably at one time, we thought exports were just as you described, with that ship coming over and shattering what is an export. Very nice visual, Bruce. The entire product was made here and purchased somewhere else. But that's not always the case. Snchez is a good example. You make the more sophisticated piece of a solar panel here, and the part where it gets encased, as Fred mentioned, maybe gets done in India. But a more interesting example of where there is value in trade in both countries, Brazil and the United States, one of Fred's targeted markets, one of my targeted markets. Brazil has a company called Embraer, and they make aircraft. They sell them here in the United States. They sell them all over the world. And at first you would lament that, gosh, they're a competitor, and this is a problem for us. Well, actually, 60 to 70% of the content of each Embraer aircraft is U.S. content. Right. And so you have a supply chain process that greatly benefits us. The entire aircraft isn't made here in the United States, but a big chunk of that aircraft, the components of it, are made here. And it really helps us when those airplanes are sold to third countries. So I think there are advantages to foreign investment abroad. I think here, though, in terms of making sure we retain the Snchez of the world, that's where the clusters that you talk about in this study become very, very important. Because one of the reasons that a company will stay here is because they have the talent here, they have the research and development capabilities. So we need to continue to invest in those things to continue to retain big chunks of that process here.
Okay, questions? I guess Jamie, as our host, maybe should start.
Thanks. A hobby horse of Bruce's is data collection and measurability, which I completely agree with. How do you, the two of you, think you're going to be able to measure the success of your efforts a year from now, 2 years from now, beyond the merely anecdotal, which is obviously important? But
well, first 5 months of this year, exports are up 17.7% over a year ago. So frankly, at that level, we're going to double exports. One way we measure it
but maybe that's a bad year to compare to.
Well, it may be a bad year, but the president said we're going to double exports based on 2009. You have to pick a starting point. Do you want to pick 2008? Do you want to pick 2007? Pick a starting point.
2007, that was a good.
Well, then give us 8 years or 9 years.
Chrystia, we're sticking with 2009. Thank you.
A lot of people like to stick to 2009.
So one, we're doubling it. We're at the rate we're going, and now 5 months isn't 5 years, but 5 months is a running start. We're actually on a trajectory that we're going to double exports. So the actual data, Jamie, is one, we've got very good data that comes out of the Commerce Department on a monthly basis in terms of exports, in terms of what countries are buying. Countries like Indonesia, many of the countries in Asia are actually, our exports in total are up 17%, and a lot of the Asian countries, they're up 36%, 40%. Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, they're actually at much faster rates. So we'll actually have solid metrics there. We at the Export-Import Bank, I know exactly what we finance on a weekly basis in terms of to what impact we're having there. The third piece we track, as I said, similar to Bruce, is we actually look at how many companies are we helping, to what countries are we taking them to, and to what number of new customers. So we actually have a metric that goes beyond just the dollars, because at XM, I'm hoping that after we help a company for a couple of years, they actually don't need our help. We helped John Deere get into Russia. After a number of years, they learned the market. They didn't need our help anymore. We helped them in new markets, or we'll help them in markets that have a financial setback where they could use our financial assistance for a year or two until that market recovers.
Jamie, it's a great question, one that my boss, the Secretary of Commerce, would applaud for you simply asking, because he's constantly asking me, how are we measuring our success? And right now, the International Trade Administration is largely focused on implementing the President's National Export Initiative. And we're doing it by focusing on short-term and long-term. So the short-term plan, and it's not a very creative name, but it's the 12-month plan.
At least it's not a 5-year plan.
It's not a 5-year plan. It's a 12-month plan. And we have very specific measurements. So export successes through some of our traditional activities of trade missions, reverse trade missions. One of our most important offices in terms of achieving the NEI is the Advocacy Center. And we track export U.S. content in projects that we help facilitate. And I'm very happy to say that in the first 5 months, the Advocacy Center has helped land deals that are reaching almost $12 billion in U.S. content. Then the next thing we do, matching up our efforts in advocacy, matching up our export successes support, there's a formula that translates to the number of jobs created from those export successes. And we have goals that we've set to achieve them. And we're largely on track to achieve them. But we very much are tracking what we're doing to goals that have been set. And at the end of the year, we should be able to say whether the programs we invested in are doing what we need them to do.
Did they satisfy you, Jim?
That was good.
You know, if you have data without anecdotes, it does not make an illustration. Bruce's presentation is full of anecdotes that drive home the point. And if you have anecdotes without the data to back it up, they're just a bunch of stories.
Journalism.
You said that.
Ryan Malty, the British Embassy. I was wondering, the one aspect that hasn't been spoken about at all is the psychological aspect of exporting. American companies are used to a very homogenous market. Philadelphia is not as different as Washington, D.C., which is not as different as New York. But moving abroad, Paris is much different than Prague, and Kyoto is much different than Kiev. So how will, on the government side, and I hope the next panel will be able to speak to it a little bit as well, how do you kind of prepare American companies for the different business structures, the different aspects of doing business on an international stage? Because going into Europe, every country has a little tweak that makes doing business very difficult for Americans if they're not used to the process or used to dealing with certain structures that are in place.
Well, let me take a shot at that. First of all, you don't build a strong, vibrant economy like the one we have in the United States without being agile and adaptive. So I have great faith in American business that they can go into a market that has perhaps different regulations, different norms, different cultures, and do just fine. In addition to that, though, we try to help them in a number of ways. The International Trade Administration has offices in 77 countries with people that have become expert in knowing the lay of the land in those areas. So we're ready to help companies with any kind of questions, information that they have. In another 40 countries, we partner with the Department of State, where they try to help us. So I think between our own adaptability as a nation and the support that we give, and Fred's shop does it in the export financing area, and a number of other federal agencies also provide support, I think we're well positioned to expand exports and take advantage of opportunities all over the world.
You have anything to add there, Fred?
When we travel to these 9 markets, work with the Commerce Department, the senior commercial officers in each of those countries, and it's a question of tailoring the products and sometimes the dynamics of how sales are done, whether it's to a government agency or what the structures are. But they're different, but I would say they're almost more similar than they are different in many ways. And certainly, if we feel if a company can export to one country in the EU, they can, frankly, the other 27, there's a lot more similarity now that the EU is as a trading bloc.
And so do you buy the premise of the question? I mean, are Americans bad at dealing with diversity outside the U.S.?
Well, no, I think Americans are they are insular. I mean, the fact is we haven't had to do a lot of exporting, so that versus a country like in the EU. I mean, in some ways, it's like exporting from Texas to Illinois would be from Germany to France, but we're going to have to get better at it. I mean, I think, but that's why I'm I'm very optimistic about doubling our exports, because I look at the huge market appetite outside the country, and as Francisco, American companies are adaptive. They'll figure out pretty fast how to get on board. And then lastly, I would add, this work that Bruce has done, the President announcing the National Export Initiative, there is not at this point, members of Congress, mayors, governors are all interested in talking about exporting. I mean, we've done 14 metropolitan-focused export events. We've had over 3,000 small and medium-sized companies come to learn about exporting in less than a year.
Chrystia, let me add one more bit of another part of the strategy for us to help those companies that are exporting to one market. If we see interest in one of those companies to look at other markets, and perhaps this is a company that may be only selling to Canada, for example, chances are we might encourage them to look at the EU or look at Mexico before going to Indonesia or to Libya or to Algeria, markets that may be a little more challenging. So another aspect of this is perhaps take some baby steps. If you're in one market, go to another market that perhaps won't be as challenging or different. And once you've done that, then you can take on others.
Okay, we have time for one final question. Gentlemen.
My name is Femi Akibi, and I'm with African Development Center, originally from Nigeria. My question, in light of the Chinese dominance in the export finance arena, what is the U.S. strategy to have a financial scheme that could compete with the Chinese? And why is it that the U.S. is not doing the same things the Chinese people are doing by battering export goods for mineral resources in Africa? Thank you.
Great question.
Give that one to you.
There are a whole host of reasons. The United States is a member of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, that was formed after World War II. Those 30-odd nations in that have an agreement of how we do financing of exports. China, Brazil, India, to name 3 of the 4 BRICS and the ones that Bruce mentioned, are not members. China can offer financing terms that we cannot. That's the quote unquote the arrangement that all those countries have. That said,
would you like that to change?
Well, we're working hard to bring China and Brazil and India into the fold, but it's a long-term proposition. What we are trying to do is twofold. One, U.S. companies are not going to sell the cheapest goods. If you're looking for price, we're not going to be the cheapest competitor out there. But you know what? People buy cars, people buy foods, people buy medical equipment. They don't always buy the cheapest goods. So just on price alone is not the only criteria. In financing terms, we actually have gone to the OECD, and in one case we have a proposal in that with approval, we will match the Chinese financial terms. And we have the ability to do that. We have petitions to do that.
Is that the first time?
That we are the first country, and this is the first time in over 30 years that mechanism has been employed. So if we get the order, it'll be great news. We still wait and see if we get the order. But we have actually.
Who's the order from?
I couldn't tell you that. But
you could. Choose not to.
I choose not to because I want to make sure we get the order.
Industry going to give us the sector?
It will be a good industry. It'll be something that it will be a subject and an industry that was in some way mentioned in this room in the last hour.
Anything to add on the China-Africa question?
Well, I think that, as Fred has alluded to, one of the things that will make trade benefit all countries is that we play with a level playing field. And in many ways, we're in a transition with emerging countries like China, emerging markets rather, like China, Brazil, and India. They certainly are not the developing countries that they were 10 years ago. And yet they have not necessarily agreed to play by the same rules that all the member countries of the OECD have played. And so I think we're in a bit of a transition there, but it's important for trade to work for all countries, that we do play by the same rules, and I hope that we move in that direction.
If I could just ask a follow-up question to the gentleman who asked the question, would you like to see American companies competing more aggressively with Chinese companies in Africa?
That's correct. That's yes is the answer. The fact that the Chinese people are very, very aggressive and they're willing to do everything and anything to get what they want. And the U.S. is just stand by looking. Before you know it, they've dominated the market. They have over 15 million people in the continent already. And U.S. companies are not equally participating. We would like to see more U.S. participation in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, there's an assignment, gentlemen.
Well, let me say this. We actually have a Sub-Saharan Africa mandate initiative at the bank. I've got an advisory. We are looking to do far more exports to Africa, and frankly, it's one of our largest markets for aircraft. We've sold over $3 billion worth of Boeing aircraft, which is helping to build an infrastructure in Africa that really provides a transportation network. But there are limitations to how we are allowed to compete with the Chinese, and that's a thorny issue the developing world is coming to grips with right now, and in a way that was not an issue 3 or 4 years ago.
If U.S. is very good in building infrastructure, the whole of the continent is in need of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what the Chinese are using. I'll build you a stadium, give us zinc. I'll build you a road, give us copper. What is wrong with U.S. doing that?
We don't have a command and control economy.
Okay, I think that's a very good assignment for you, though, and a good concluding note. Not to build a command and control economy, which would not be my personal preference, but maybe to do a better job on Africa.
I would agree with that. That's exactly one of our goals.
I concur.
We have to move on now to our next panel, but I hope you'll join me in thanking our terrific interpretation panel. That was really good. Thank you.